What's up, guys? We're going to be talking about setting up our coding environment so we can practice writing in various programming languages. Now, the first recommended step is to grab a copy of Visual Studio Code. It's fairly straightforward just to grab a copy of Visual Studio Code and download it from their webpage. We won't go through this for every operating system. Also, if you already have a code editor which you'd prefer to use, feel free to make use of that instead of Visual Studio Code. There's no real reason why it has to be Visual Studio Code. The reason why we're using it in this course is because, as you'll go on to see, Visual Studio Code has some extensions that allow us to run and test the code inside the code editor. So we're now inside Visual Studio Code. And one of the first steps is going to be to initialize a working directory. Now, we already have one open. If you look over on the left-hand side, you can see we're inside this code directory. We already have some files that have been created. When you open Visual Studio Code for the first time, you won't have this, but you can right-click and choose the option to add folder to workspace. And initially, this should just be an empty folder where you intend to keep your code snippets. Once that folder has been loaded into Visual Studio Code, we can right-click and choose the option to create a new file. I've done this 3 times. So I've created javascript.js. So the file name is JavaScript, but that .js extension of the file indicates that it's a JavaScript file. Same with php.php. The name of the file is PHP, but the .php extension indicates that this is a file that holds PHP code. And the same with python.py. The py indicates that inside this file is Python code. Now, over on the left-hand side in Visual Studio Code, we have this extensions. And one of the extensions that I'm making use of here is called Code Runner. And the idea behind Code Runner is it allows us to execute these scripts within Visual Studio Code. So we can basically test to see how our code works. Now, there's a settings option, and just to show you which settings we've made use of here, first of all, I've toggled on this option, clear previous output. And the second option is this show execution message, which I've disabled. Now, just to take a look at how this works, if we head back to our working directory, let's open javascript.js, and we have our first line of code, console.log, and inside brackets, we have hello world, and that's inside single quotes. Now, one of the key features of any programming language is we want a way of printing stuff to the screen. Now, the nice thing about the Code Runner extension is we can run this JavaScript simply by using the keyboard shortcut Control, Alt, and N. Let's see what happens. And the results of our code, which has been run, now appear in this output window. So this is JavaScript code, and all it does is log out or print out hello world to the output. Now let's have a look at php.php. What we're seeing is pretty much the same code, but written with a different syntax. So we've seen in JavaScript how to print something to the screen. This is how to print something to the screen making use of PHP. So let's try to execute this PHP code with Control, Alt, and N. We now get hello world PHP echoed to the screen or printed to the screen. Finally, let's have a look at Python. Same thing. We now have print, and inside brackets, inside double quotes, we have hello world Python. And when we run that code, we have hello world Python printed to the screen. So we might wonder, if all of these languages do the same thing, how do we know which language we should be using? And the truth is that languages are very flexible. Something that we might do with one language, we can easily achieve with another language. For example, PHP is a popular server-side language for hosting web pages. But guess what? You can do the exact same thing with Python. And you can also do the exact same thing with JavaScript. Now, JavaScript is most commonly associated with a programming language that runs in the browser and allows us to generate dynamic or animated web pages. But JavaScript can also run on the back end of a server. It's something that's referred to as node.js. It's a type of JavaScript that specifically runs on the server. So we can pretty much, to some extent, do anything with any coding language. But these languages do have their strengths. There are specific things that these languages are used for. So as an example, PHP can actually be run from the command line, but in most cases it's used as a server-side programming language for hosting web pages. That's its most common use. And JavaScript can be used for a range of different things, but most of the time JavaScript is used for animating or creating dynamic web pages. Python, again, it could be used to host web pages, but a lot of the time Python might be used for other types of projects, maybe to do with data science or machine learning, or pretty much anything else that you might need a script for. For example, Python is often used by hackers and penetration testers for testing the security of various websites. So in some senses, it potentially doesn't matter too much which language you pick as your first language. But if there is something specific you want to achieve with your programming, it's worth doing some research to see which programming language is most commonly used for a certain type of activity, because that's likely going to be the programming language we want to choose. Now, just a side note here, in terms of the way Visual Studio Code is going to work. These scripts are only running because these programming languages are already installed. In fact, if I head to the terminal, this is actually a PowerShell terminal, which runs on Windows. If we have a look at the directory we're inside this directory with the 3 files. So when we execute the script, it's the equivalent of running them from the command line. So for example, javascript.js, it's running with Node. It's clearly not running inside a browser at the moment. So executing this script inside Visual Studio Code using the Code Runner extension is the equivalent of firing up the command line and typing node javascript.js. We see hello world printed to the screen. It's obviously run that. Same thing for that PHP file. It's the equivalent of typing PHP and then specifying the location of the file, which is php.php. We can see our PHP executed. And finally, Python, the equivalent of typing Python followed by python.py. And we see our Python script executed. Depending on which operating system you're running, you might even need to type something like Python 3 python.py to indicate which version of Python you want to use. So depending on which programming language you choose, you will want to do a little bit of extra research alongside this video to make sure your programming language is installed. And you can install your programming language on any operating system. If we take something like node.js, for example, which we'll be using to run the JavaScript scripts, well, that works fine on Linux, macOS, and Windows. So it's just a case of making sure that is installed, then you'll be able to run the scripts yourself. Absolute key takeaway from this video is simply that you have some sort of text editor, and it's recommended that you grab Visual Studio Code for that purpose.